Soil analysis. Remains of ancient inhabited cities and ancient cemeteries can usually be located by an analysis of the soil. Since calcium phosphate is the main constituent of bones and man's other waste materials, its percentage will 59 W. M. F. Petrie, 1901. 60 R. E. Leinington, 1970. 61 M. J. Aitken, 1961. 224. African archaeology and its techniques, including dating techniques, naturally be much higher in areas of occupation or burial. Therefore, the limits of such archaeological zones can be found by analyzing soil samples taken at regular intervals from the zone and measuring their phosphate content. Pollen analysis. Pollination in flowering plants usually takes place by the action of birds, insects or wind. Flowers pollinated by wind produce large quantities of pollen grains, most of which fall to the ground without being fertilized. These pollen grains usually decay, but if they happen to fall on suitable soil, such as mud or peat bogs, they may become fossilized and can easily be examined under the microscope. The identification and enumeration of the various types of pollen present in a sample is of potential value in archaeology as a means of providing information about the ecological environment in which human remains and artifacts are situated, and a knowledge of the ecological environment may in turn point to the kind of life which prevailed at that time. Pollen analysis is only useful as a technique for dating. However, if the pollen spectra can be related to a time scale based on some direct dating method such as radiocarbon dating. For further details of this technique, see Fonte and Iverson, 62 and Dimleby, 63. Electrical resistivity surveying. This was the first geophysical technique to be adapted to archaeology. In this technique, an electrical voltage is applied to the ground and the resistance to the flow of electric current is measured. The resistance depends upon the nature of the ground, the quantity of water retained in its pores and its content of soluble salts. Hard compact rocks such as granite and diorite have a very high resistivity compared with clay soil. Therefore resistivity surveying will mainly apply to the detection of stone-built structures buried in muddy soil and earth field features cut into rock. 64. The normal system used in this method is to insert 4 metal probes into the ground, pass the current between the 2 outer probes and measure the resistivity between the inner 2. The value of the resistance obtained is a rough average for the material beneath the inner probes down to a depth of approximately 1 to 5 times the distance between them, as long as it is fairly uniform. 55. Normally almost all the applications of resistivity surveying consist of making lines of reading, keeping the same contact arrangement and 62. Kate Fonte and J. Iverson, 1950. 63. G. W. Dimleby, 1963. 64. M. J. Aitken, 1961. 65. R. E. Leinington, 1970. 225. Methodology and African prehistory. Separations in order to locate changes in the measured resistivity values. Often these lines will be combined to give an overall rectangular grid of values, and the location of buried features will be indicated by the parts which give abnormal readings. This technique has now been somewhat replaced by magnetic prospecting. This is mainly due to some disadvantages, mainly the slow survey speed and dependence on long-term climatic effects, coupled with the fact that the interpretation of results tends to be difficult except in the simplest cases. 66. Magnetic surveying. This is the most common technique used now in archaeological prospecting. In this technique the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field is measured at points above the present ground surface in the site to be prospected. The variations in these measurements can reveal the presence of archaeological features. By this technique it is possible to detect buried remains of iron, baked pottery structures such as kilns and furnaces, soil-filled pits cut into rock, or rock structures buried in clay soil. The variations due to buried iron objects are very large, but those due to the other categories are very much weaker. Consequently, the technique of magnetic surveying cannot be of any use unless the detecting instrument is sufficiently sensitive to detect very small variations, besides being speedy and simple to operate. 67. The Archaeological Research Laboratory of Oxford University has succeeded in developing the proton magnetometer which meets all these requirements. 68. It is composed of two parts, the detector bottle and the counter. The HE detector bottle is carried on a wooden tripod and moved by one operator from point to point over the area to be surveyed. A second operator controls the counter and records the readings in plan form. The HE interpretation of a plan should identify the situation and outlines of buried archaeological structures. 69 of their forms of magnetometers have been developed, namely, the differential proton magnetometer, the flux G8 gradiometer, 70 the cesium magnetometer, the electron spin resonance pumped magnetometer. 7 Every one of these has advantages, but the most useful form for almost all cases is, however, the differential proton magnetometer. The HE magnetic method has several advantages over the resistivity method since it is simpler and faster, and its results are easier to interpret. 72. 66. LOC. SIT. 67. M. J. Aitken, 1963. 68. M. J. Aitken, 1961. 69. LOC. SIT. 70. E. T. Hall, 1965, page 112. 71. I. Scholar, 1970. 72. R. E. Linington, 1970. 226. African archaeology and its techniques including dating techniques probing the Egyptian pyramids with cosmic rays. Cosmic rays consist of a stream of electrically charged particles known as flash imsons or ions. These rays reach the Earth with equal intensity from all points in the sky. The square meter is struck by some iota or newtons per second, whatever its direction MOIB. Cosmic rays have a very high penetrating power and are much more penetrating than X-rays, and their velocity is almost equal to the velocity of light. Probing with these rays is useful because the newtons lose energy as they pass through matter. The HE loss of energy or absorption of newtons is proportional to the density and thickness of the matter through which they pass. The intensity or quantity of cosmic rays which passes can be estimated by a device known as the spark chamber, which in the case of the pyramids was placed inside the subterranean chamber. Newtons which have passed through a void or an unknown chamber or passage would be slowed down to a lesser degree than those which traverse the solid rock, and therefore the cosmic rays which pass through voids would have a greater intensity, and this will be shown by the spark chambers. With two spark chambers oriented horizontally, and about 0.3 meters apart from each other in the vertical direction, it would be possible not only to detect any hidden chamber, but also to indicate its location to within a few meters. Excavation would then be conducted to reach the predicted void or chamber. Probing started in the second pyramid, which belongs to King Chephren of the 4th dynasty 2600 before our era. The HE data were analyzed by means of a computer and the results were announced on April 30, 1969, indicating two important facts. The HE first is that the burial chamber of the king does not fall exactly in the center of the base of the pyramid but lies a few meters towards the north. This finding agrees with the surveying results, thus proving the validity of this technique for probing the pyramids. The second fact is that the upper third of this pyramid does not contain any unknown chambers or corridors. The experiment had to be repeated using another apparatus which was designed in such a way that it would be able to probe the whole pyramid. The analysis of the recorded data indicated that the whole pyramid does not contain any unknown voids, a fact which agrees with archaeological expectations. Techniques of conservation. It is not intended here to describe the technical methods used in the conservation of artifacts made of various materials, such as pottery, faience, glass, ivory, bone, wood, leather, papyrus, woven fabrics, metals, etc., since these are very varied and need much more space than is allowed for this chapter. For their conservation, reference is made to the more 227. Methodology and African Prehistory. Specialized books 73 and periodicals, particularly Studies in Conservation, the Journal of the International Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, London. The most serious problems of conservation in Africa, however, are the great fragility of materials and the violent deterioration of stone monuments. Great fragility of materials owing to the excessive heat and dryness of many countries in Africa. Artifacts made of organic materials, such as parchment, papyrus, leather, wood, ivory, etc., have become extremely fragile. Such materials should be handled with great care, lest they should crumble into tiny fragments. They have at first to be kept for some time in a closed wet system, wrapped in damp blotting paper sheets, or treated with steam in a steam box, to restore their malleability wholly or partly. They can then be safely unrolled or unfolded without their breaking into pieces. After retaining their malleability, such artifacts should be exhibited or kept in air-conditioned museums or storehouses at a temperature of 17 degrees ±2 degrees C and relative humidity of 60 to 65%, so that they may not become brittle again as they would if exposed to dry climatic conditions. Violent deterioration of stone monuments. This grave problem will be discussed in more detail. Main causes of deterioration. The main agencies which cause the severe decay of stone in African monuments are: A. Migration of salts. Soluble salts migrate in the presence of water or moisture from the saline soil into the stone monuments by capillary action. In dry conditions, these salts pass in the form of aqueous solutions from the inside of the stone to its outer surface, and may crystallize under the surface, causing it to flake out. These effects are more pronounced on the surface itself, causing its disintegration, or may crystallize at the bottom of walls or columns where the stone meets the saline soil, as can be seen in some of the columns of the Buhan Temple, Sudan Plate 9.4. B. Drastic atmospheric agencies. In Africa, the stone is badly affected by the great variations in temperature and humidity. These lead to the gradual flaking out of the surface layers of most kinds of stone. In many places, especially in coastal regions, both factors of decay act together, leading to very serious deterioration of the monuments, as can be seen very conspicuously in the Roman temples at Leptis in Aegina and Sabratha in Libya. 73. R. M. Morgan, 1968, H. J. Plenterlife, 1962, E. Paddock, 1963, G. Savage, 1967. 228. African archaeology and its techniques, including dating techniques. Surface treatment and its inadequacy. Extensive trials have been made to consolidate deteriorated stone surfaces by treating them with organic preservatives or inorganic silicates. Such treatment proved not only to be ineffective, but also to be deleterious, since it accelerates deterioration and flaking out of the stone. The failure of these trials has been stressed by the International Symposium on the Conservation of Stone Monuments, which declared that the problem of strengthening stone is still far from solved and that this difficult problem must be approached with care. International efforts to solve the problem. The difficulty of the problem and its seriousness led ICOMOS and the International Center for Conservation to form in 1967 a committee of 10 specialists in stone conservation to study the problem. The HE Group has made many studies and presented several reports and continued its activities up to the end of 1975 to draft a series of standard tests to evaluate the degrees of deterioration of stone and the efficiency of various conservation treatments. New Hope. Professor Lewin has developed a new method for the strengthening of limestone and marble surfaces. 74. It comprises the treatment of the deteriorated parts with a hot concentrated solution of barium hydroxide about 20% containing some urea about 10% and glycerol about 15%. The method depends chemically on the replacement of the calcium ions in the decayed stone with barium ions. The HE treatment causes the stone to become markedly harder and more resistant to the action of deteriorating agents. Since the newly formed barium carbonate forms the continuous part of the body of the stone and does not form a surface coat which has different properties from those of the inside, this method offered a new hope that the treated surfaces would not scale off and would protect the underlying layers from attack by weathering agents. This treatment was applied in July 1973 for strengthening the disintegrating surface of the neck of the limestone statue of the Sphinx at Giza. The result is satisfactory up to the time of writing, but we shall have to keep the neck under observation for 10 more years at least before we can report on the validity of this technique for the conservation of deteriorating limestone. Remedial measures. Despite the hope we have in Lewin's technique, the problem of conserving stone monuments by chemical treatments has to be considered still unsolved. Certain mechanical measures, however, are recommended to 74. S. Z. Lewin, 1968. 229. Methodology and African prehistory protect the monuments from the action of deteriorating agencies, namely, ADHE surfaces of outdoor monuments which are exposed to direct sun rays should not be treated with any preservative solutions which close the pores of the stone, otherwise the surface layers will scale off. BDHE soil in which the monuments are constructed must be desalinated periodically by washing with water drained off by a well-designed drainage system. C. Whenever possible, the stone monument is to be insulated from the salty soil to cut off the migration of the soluble salts from the soil to the stone. The HE insulation can be done by introducing a lead sheet or a thick layer of bitumen under the statue, wall or column, etc. D. If the monument contains soluble salts which cause efflorescence or cryptofluorescence, these salts have to be extracted by washing with water and slash or by coating the salt-infected parts with wet sandy clay several times until the stone becomes almost completely free from soluble salts. E. If the monument is fairly small, it can be removed from the open air to a museum or a shelter in order to protect its surfaces from the deleterious effects of atmospheric agencies. An alternative solution is to keep it in its original place and construct a shelter over it. F. A missing roof should be rebuilt to protect interior mural paintings or reliefs from the action of direct sunlight and rain and decrease to some extent the deterioration due to great variations in temperature and humidity. Recommendations for restoration. Since an erroneous treatment of artifacts or monuments may cause more damage or even complete deterioration, some of the important rules of restoration which have been recommended in international conferences are widely quoted. ADHE patina of old monuments should not be washed off or removed in any way to show the original color of the stone. The HE cleaning of the facade should be confined to dust removal so as to keep the pali untouched, since it is the most important archaeological character a monument possesses. In the restoration of ancient monuments, only the falling parts have to be rebuilt in their original places. Replacements and additions should be avoided unless they are needed for supporting the fallen parts or for protecting the old surfaces from being attacked by weathering agents. In all cases of rebuilding, the mortar should be intercalated between the stones so that their weights are evenly distributed to prevent strains or cracks in the structure. DDHE mortar used for the renovation of walls should, as a rule, be identical with the original mortar unless the latter is of gypsum. The HE use of cement is not to be recommended in the case of buildings constructed of sedimentary rocks such as limestone or sandstone. EDHE mortar most recommended in all cases of rebuilding is salt-free. 230. African archaeology and its techniques, including dating techniques. Lime putty mortar, since it is fairly malleable and porous and would not therefore prevent slight movement of stones due to changes in temperature, and consequently no strains or cracks would occur. F. As regards methods for distinguishing the surfaces of the added stones, the following are worth noting. IDHE and EW facing can be slightly inset from the vertical surface of the original stonework. Different materials could be used but the dimensions of the original blocks be restored. Alternatively, the same type of material could be used but the form and dimensions of the blocks could be made different from those in the original parts. IVDHE alignment of the stone courses and all the joints could be conformed to, but new blocks molded using a conglomerate of stone chips of uneven sizes. The identification marks carrying the date of restoration could be incised on all new stones. The IDHE surface of the new stones could be made entirely distinct from that of the old by pecking it with a pointed tool to give a certain grain or engraving it deeply with a graver to let it acquire a certain geometrical design, preferably of parallel or intersecting lines. 231. Plate 9. By X-ray photograph of the frontal chest of the mummy of Queen Nejmer 21st Dynasty. It shows that a large scarab and 4 small statuettes representing the 4 sons of Horus still remain in the thoracic cavity after unwrapping the mummy. Cairo Museum. Plate 9.2 Microphoto of a section in a copper staple from the Cheops boat at Giza showing the fragment of dendritic character due to hammering. Plate 9.4 The bottom part of one of the sandstone columns, Buhan Temple, Sudan. This illustrates the flaking away of the surface layer due to efflorescence. Plate 9.3 Glass block showing the flat upper surface, lateral sides and a part of the ferting crucible left adhering to the right side. 232. History and linguistics. P. D-I-A-G-N-E. Hayada Koe Dertendna Wani Fulfulani I Decall Dem Wolof speech is what gives shape to the past. The African sees a link between history and language. This view is COMMON to Bangda, Yoruba and Mande. but that is not its originality. Indeed, an Arab or a Greek before the time of Thucydides would certainly agree with the Fulani dictum that narrative is where we meet the past. Hanki ko hidarority. What is special about the link between history and language in the African tradition lies in the view of history and language to which that tradition, on the whole, has adhered. Language and thought are often identified, and history is seen not as science but as wisdom and as an art of living. History aims at knowledge of the past. Linguistics is a science of language and speech. Historical narrative and historical works are contents and forms of thought. Language itself is the medium and prop of such thought. Thus, obviously, linguistics and history each have their domain, their particular subject matter and their methods. Nevertheless, there is interaction between them, at least from 2 points of view. Language as a system and tool of communication is a historical phenomenon. It has its own history. As the medium of thought, and that of the past and knowledge of the past, it is the channel and the most important source of historical evidence. Thus linguistics, used here in its widest sense, covers an area of research which supplies history with at least 2 kinds of data. First, linguistic information properly speaking, and secondly, evidence which might be termed supralinguistic. Linguistics can be used to see beyond the evidence of thought, beyond the conceptual apparatus used in a language and the oral or written evidence, to the history of men and their civilizations. Once the problem is thus defined, it is easier to see what common ground there is between the historian and the linguist working on Africa. 0. Methodology and African prehistory. The linguistic sciences and history. All the sciences that take language and thought as their subject matter can contribute to historical research. However, some have a more direct connection with history. This is the established view, though it may, on further reflection, be questionable. Thus it is usual to say the study of relationships between languages is the crossroads between linguistics and history. It is not so easy to say the same of an analysis of the development of material furnished by written or oral texts and by the vocabulary of a language. Yet both types of research are concerned with the facts of language or thought, and thus with the facts of history. Here, European historiography is suggested a separation between historical science properly speaking and literary history or the history of ideas. This distinction is justifiable only in certain contexts. The Congo of the Bantu civilization, the Igbo of Guinea or the Susu of the Sudan have left few, if any, texts which meet the norms of modern historical science. On the other hand, as far as sources of information are concerned, they did produce an abundant oral literature, divided more or less clearly into genres and works which one might nowadays be tempted to classify under the heading of short stories, narratives of various kinds, chronicles, historical epics, legends, myths, philosophical or cosmogony works, or technical, religious or sacred thinking. In them, the historically true is mingled with fiction and the purely imaginary with events that can be precisely dated. In order to reconstruct the history of the Congo, the Igbo or the Susu, use is made not only of the critical analysis of such literature and oral tradition, but also of the critical analysis of their discourse, their techniques and knowledge through the deciphering of the languages, concepts and vocabulary which they used, and which still, taken together, reveal the history of each of the groups. We shall refer to various sciences and methods which can be used to guide the African historian, but the list will not be exhaustive. This may be a good thing from the point of view of clarity. The linguist sets reasonable limits to his study, and this enables him to study particular areas in detail. He thus leaves the study of the history of ideas, the sciences, economics or literature to the appropriate experts. WHO then take into account the linguistic dimension of their investigations. The science of classification and the history of the African peoples to classify languages is to uncover the relationships between the peoples who speak them, and the history of those peoples. Several types of classification may be distinguished. 234. History and linguistics. Genetic classification. This classification establishes relationships and affiliations within a linguistic family, and thus helps at least to some extent to re-establish the historical unity of peoples and cultures using languages derived from a common stock. Typological classification. This method of classification groups together languages having obvious structural or systemic similarities and affinities. Languages of identical or quite different origin have the same kinds of lexical structure, as regards nouns, verbs or pronouns, whilst at the same time being phonetically, historically or geographically far removed. The he tendency to use the same noun and verb form is found both in Wolof and English. Ligi ligi ed to work work then, but despite this typological similarity the two idioms are far removed, both generically and geographically. Moreover, languages may belong to the same family but be of different types. Their kinship rests on their possession of a convincing amount of a common vocabulary even though they have developed along different structural lines. Sometimes, owing to lexical borrowings and losses, the differences may be revealed in the lexicon itself. The classifications of African languages so far drawn up do not, for example, group together some members of the so-called Chadic or the so-called Senegal-Guinea families of languages. Yet, on further consideration their phonological systems, morphology and syntactical structure suggest that typologically the majority at any rate of these languages in fact belong together. Geographical classification. This method of classification is mainly the result of an instinctive tendency to compare and group together languages which at the present time exist in any one setting. It is often founded on inadequate data. Where Africa is concerned, this classification, though based on evident geographical considerations, leaves out of account such phenomena as migrations and overlappings of peoples. Cole, Delafos, Westerman and Greenberg mainly use topological and geographical denominations and groupings. They thus categorize languages as being West Atlantic, Niger-Congo, Senegal-Guinea, Niger-Chad, and so on. A valid classification of African languages requires procedures which ensure that the forms, vocabulary and linguistic structures which it is proposed to use as elements in a comparison are not only representative of the languages to be compared, but also belong to the original heritage of those languages. Any resemblance should be due neither to borrowing nor to earlier or more recent contacts. 235. Methodology and African prehistory. For historical reasons which are familiar, Arabic and the Semitic languages and also French, Portuguese, Afrikaans and English have been depositing a considerable amount of vocabulary in many African languages for several centuries, sometimes for thousands of years. Some variants of Kiswahili contain more than 60% of lexical borrowings from Arabic. It is easy to go one step further, out of religious enthusiasm or lack of scientific care, and conclude that Kiswahili belongs to the Semito-Arabic group. This conclusion has, indeed, sometimes been drawn. Forms which were originally common to more than one language may in the course of time have undergone phonetic, morphological or structural changes. This development, which is bound by philological rules, is a well-known and analyzable phenomenon. Even the meanings of these forms, the meanings of the words in the vocabulary to be compared, may have varied within the limits of a semantic field which it is possible to some extent to define. The he modern form of Wolof, for instance, shows the failure of the final vowel after a geminate, bot or fat replacing bapa or fata, which are still preserved by the Gambians and Lebu. The ancient Egyptian form Nabs has become Nabdu in modern Fofo, and Nit in Wolof. The he bandu says Mutu Madu, the Hausa Mutu, Amande Mixi or Moxo, the Etho and Chibato, the Mina Agbido, etc. The he Egyptian Zirmit once meant burnt or black. Today it is used in the sense of ashes, burns, etc. The historical reconstruction of a language as a method of rediscovering the vocabulary and common structural heritage takes account of these changes. The reconstruction method makes it possible to retrace the history of a language or a language family. It helps to establish the original proto-language, and to date the times at which the various branches split off. To this extent reconstruction is an invaluable taxonomic aid. Various criteria and techniques are used to reconstruct a language and reinvent its original components. Sound shifts play an important part in the reconstruction of a proto-language for the establishment of a family relationship. Then it is known, for example, that in one variant the P becomes F and in another the U becomes 0. It is possible, by positing Pode, Utitium equals low, to reconstruct the original phonetic system and forms. Phonological reconstruction. This is a step in the reconstruction of the lexical base and the original vocabulary. The phonemes are not the only things that change, the morphology and structure also develop. The he subject function in Latin is indicated by an inflection called the nominative, whereas in languages of Latin origin or influenced by Latin, this function is indicated mainly by word order. HOMO videt equals videt homo equals liamba vu equals the man saw in. Reconstructing proto-languages, proto-Bangla, proto-Chadic, etc. 236. History and linguistics reference is always made to the vocabulary, the common lexical stock. It is thus possible to make lexical count and work out percentages of words in COMMON. J.H. Greenberg. The classification mainly relies on this technique, and D. Sapir in his work on the West Atlantic Group 2 also uses this method. He concludes that Sirer and Fulani, which he places in the same group, have 37% of words in COMMON, Baga, Koba and TM Handy have 79%, TM Handy and Sirer have only 5%, and Baisari and Safan also 5%. Yet he groups all these languages together in the same family. But the extent of COMMON vocabulary, something that may easily be borrowed, is not enough to prove or disprove the historical link. We therefore take other factors, for example, similarity of typological features or identity of structure, into account by comparing, for example, pronominal, verbal or nominal systems, and so on. The typological component, taken together with the data furnished by lexical and phonological analysis, makes it possible to arrive at results which are all the more convincing in that history and outside influence have been taken into account. Reconstruction also aims to date the period when this COMMON heritage was shared within a proto-language and taken over by related languages and in the process of differentiation. It is concerned to establish the character of the original language that gave rise to the various languages traceable to a single proto-language. Reconstruction and dating can also be used to determine the age of lexical and structural material collected in the course of the study of the languages and, through comparison, to define with varying degrees of certainty the level at which the languages in question are related. These techniques also provide precise landmarks in the history of the separation of peoples who originally belonged to the same cultural and linguistic world. At the same time, they shed light on the history of ethnic groups and multinational or multi-ethnic civilizations. In research concerned with the recent age and written languages, the task is relatively simple. But in research which goes back 4,000 years or more before our era, the scarcity of evidence makes for difficulties. The task, however, simply becomes one of working out the history of decisive periods of linguistic change. The processes of change in vocabulary or structure which are examined with this purpose, as we shall see, are very slow and difficult to grasp. To make up for this scarcity of information, there are techniques of varying effectiveness. Glottochronology is one of the most recent of such techniques which has been applied in the African field. Its principle is that of dating the lexical development of a language from the rate of change of its vocabulary, its cultural vocabulary, philosophical concepts, techniques, etc. and basic vocabulary names of parts of the body, numbers from 1 to 5, the words for natural phenomena, etc. Glottochronology, as a technique, is intended 1. J.H. Greenberg, 1963a. 2. D. Sapir, 1971b. 237. Methodology and African Prehistory to provide information on the age and the stage and state of development of lexical terms and forms. The fundamental or basic vocabulary develops relatively slowly in early societies, at least when there are no catastrophic historical changes of influences. In Black Africa, in particular, the work of Delafosse has enabled us to form an idea of this rate of development by using lists of words recorded in writing since the 11th century. Delafosse's work deals with the vocabulary of the languages of the Sudan collected in Arabic texts. Such vocabulary remains almost unchanged over 1,000 years of history. Not only is the development of the basic vocabulary slow, it is also suggested by proponents of glottochronology that the rate is constant in all languages. This is the view of Swadesh, who has sought to apply this theory to African languages. Tests carried out in some specific contexts seem to confirm this hypothesis. Glottochronology postulates a rate of change among the items of the basic vocabulary which can be measured in percentages. The ratio of vocabulary retention, the theory goes, varies between 81 plus 2 and 85 plus minus 0 to 4% for a given period of 1,000 years. On this basis, glottochronology has provided a number of conclusions by applying the following equation. T equals jog underscore C underscore 1 to 4 log RT equals duration, C equals percentage of terms COMM to the languages being compared, R equals ratio of retention. The HE question is whether, on the basis of the results obtained, glottochronology can be considered a valid time gauge, the sort of historical time clock. In fact, the findings fall short of expectations for one simple reason: in the context of linguistic overlapping and lexical interference, the extent of which it is difficult to determine, and with no precise evidence from written or other sources, it is not easy in the present state of research to arrange the data in series, to distinguish between normal change and changes due to borrowing, even within the basic lexicon. In the future, however, the classificatory science which applied all these techniques would provide the key to ethnic and linguistic relationships. Linguistic classifications and ethno-cultural relations. Despite some remarkable studies, the problem of linguistic and ethnical relationships in Africa is far from being solved. In many areas, intuition still takes precedence over scientifically established proof in the detection of such relationships. The HE idea and the notion of a Bantu community uniting the vast majority of Central and Southern African peoples were born in the 19th century with the work of W. H. I. Bleek. In his famous book published in 1862, Bleek established a close relationship between the languages and dialectal variants spoken over a vast area inhabited by ethnic groups differing in various degrees from one another, and using languages. 238. History and linguistics, which showed various degrees of intercomprehensibility. Similarities of language and culture obviously most apparent in a situation where the ethnic groups concerned are living side by side, as in the case with the so-called Bantu peoples. In some cases, distance in space and time creates problems. The He Fulani are a good example of this. From the Senegal Basin to the Nile Valley, they live in groups which are often isolated within the areas inhabited by very different peoples. The He Douala of Cameroon speak the Bantu language, which in practice may be considered to belong to the same Bantu subgroup as Lila, just as are the languages of Mbandaka or Kinshasa, despite the distance which separates it from the communities which speak the last two languages, and, despite its relative isolation from them, Pharaonic Egyptian, which was spoken 5,000 years ago, offers some striking resemblances to Hausa, Wolong and Songhai. 3. There are also phenomena of overlapping. Major universal, unifying languages continue for various reasons: political, economic, cultural, etc. to serve as a basis for the integration of different ethnic groups. As they advance, they wipe out languages and cultures through their social pressure and their historical weight, often leaving only remnants behind. Lila, Hausa, Swahili, Yoruba, Twi, Igbo, Bambara Daola, Fulful, Arabic and Wolof are spoken by millions or even tens of millions of speakers of different origins. The ex-vehicles of communication, they have greatly outgrown their original ethnic and geographical framework, to become languages of civilization COMM to peoples whose origins were often very different. The Fulani and the Serer constitute the great majority of Wolof speakers in Senegal. Wolof was originally the language of the Lebu ethnic group, traces of which are found on the frontier between Senegal and Mauritania. Nowadays, the Lebu are only a small minority living in the Cape Verde Peninsula. With the urbanization of Senegal, however, Wolof culture and language are facing many dialects before our very eyes. Serer, Lebu, Fulani, Daola, Noon, etc. belong to the ethnic groups of the same names which a few centuries ago were playing a very important part in the history of the area. This is a general development. Kiswahili, which is spoken by tens of millions of Bantu speakers, arose from a Zanzibar dialect used initially by a few villages. It spread very quickly over a relatively homogeneous Bantu linguistic area, until it now constitutes, together with Lila, Central and Southern Africa's main language of communication. Between 50 and 60 million people speak one of these two languages, or a closely related language. 3. This question reference should be made to the works of Mile Homburger, the chapters by Professors Greenberg and Oberga in this history, and the proceedings of the Cairo Symposium. 239. Methodology and African Prehistory. In this area Zaire, Congo, Central African Republic, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, South Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, etc. Traditional African thinking has often shown a great awareness, not only of such overlapping, but also of a role that linguistics can play in explaining and elucidating history. In African tradition, many anecdotes tell of the relationship between different languages or of the more or less mythical origin of their differentiation. Often, the observations are correct. This is true of the similarities between Foto and Seer, whose speakers almost intuitively assert a close ethnic and linguistic relationship existing between them. Monde, Bantu speakers, Kakan and Fulani, who think of themselves as people of the same language, sometimes intuitively feel themselves to be members of groups, or subgroups, of the single, Common family. In most cases, however, the observable relationships exist only because of the need to assimilate with or coexist with a community which has a position of some influence within the ethnic group. For a traditional saga will only command allegiance if the peoples concerned accept the fact of their kinship, whether this is founded in reality or myth. However, the traditional linguistic knowledge of African societies does not provide any clear indications of the existence of an ancient science or of systematic thinking on such relationships. This contrasts with what may be noted in other spheres, for example, in etymological science, in linguistic analysis itself, or even in relation to lexical phenomena. The Fulani, Bantu or Wolof master of speech and eloquence is often very consciously interested in and well informed about the origin of words. The historian of Cairo, for instance, will amuse himself picking out or wings or breaking down the word to show its origin. Barjal says the guardian of the Cairo tradition comes from Punjab. He goes on to explain both the formal contraction which the constituent parts of the word undergo, and its context and meanings. In an article by A. Tall, for there are some examples relating to such work by traditional etymologists among the Mossi and the Gurmanj. The application of classificatory science to linguistics begins with S.W. Cole, W. H. Idley and European research. The beginnings of that science were the works of the 19th century Indo-European comparativists, and research into African linguistics began with their disciples. In regional studies, there has been much work of considerable importance, if not for the originality or adequacy of its interpretations, at least for the quantity of data collected. W. H. Idley was one of the first to set out to establish that the Bantu languages were related, and in this field he preceded authors like Meinhof. For La Tradition Orale, Centre Regional de Documentation pour la Tradition Orale de Niamey, 1972. S.W. H. Idley, 1862-9. 240. History and Linguistics. Johnston. The contribution made by de la Fosse to the study of West African languages is well known. The same is true of the contributions made by C. R. Lepsius, 7a. N. Tucker 8 and G. W. Murray 9 to the study of the Nilotic languages, and Bassett to that of the Berber languages. The study of ancient Egyptian, so essential for African research, and of the Semitic or Indo-European languages of North Africa and even the Punic and Greco-Latin languages, has also been of great value. As if stressed by J.H. Greenberg, 10. The author of the most recent and now most controversial classification of the African languages, the most noted modern writings on the continent as a whole are those of Drexel 1 and Meinhof. 12. These are neither the first nor the only books in the field. Cole 13 as early as 1856, and Migio 1 for in 1914, proposed methods and types of classification. Baumann and Westermann, 15 in 1940, propound an interesting system for the same purpose. This work, however, remains controversial and is questionable for two main reasons. The first reason is that African linguistics has not escaped ethnocentric ideology. In this connection, the criticisms recently voiced by J.H. Greenberg himself are in perfect agreement with those expressed by Keek and Diop 20 years ago in Nations Negre Subcultures and repeated with the addition of more up-to-date information by T. Sobenwi in his paper to the 1977 Lagos Festival. The second reason is purely scientific. Almost all linguists feel that attempts at classification are premature. Indispensable methodological precautions are not being taken. The properly analyzed and processed material which is necessary for a genetic or even a typological comparison between African languages has not been assembled. The need for more research. Even the task of simply listing all African languages is fraught with difficulties. Work on such a list has not yet achieved any very precise results. At a rough estimate, there are in Africa between 1,300 and 1,500 systems of 6. M. De la Fosse, 1924, L. Hamburger, 1941. Among writers who put forward classifications, we should mention they were Berg, 1925 and 1930. 7. C. Arlexius, 1888. 8. 8. N. Tucker, 1940. 9. G. W. Murray, 1920. 10. J. H. Greenberg, 1957b. See the critical analysis in Greenberg, 1957b, and also in Greenberg, 1963. 11. C. F. J. H. Greenberg. 12. C. Meinhof, 1904, 1906, 1912 and 1932. 13. S. W. Cole, 1854-1963. The N. 14. F. W. Michio, 1911. 15. H. Bowman N.D. Westerman, 1962. 241. Methodology and African Prehistory. Speech which may be classified as languages. Progress has certainly been made in recent years, though the right climate does not yet exist for a really thorough work of synthesis, since some languages have still to be precisely identified and accurately analyzed, and until this has been done they can hardly be classified. A few specific examples will serve to illustrate the depth of the controversy and the extent of the uncertainty. The first two examples concern the dialects to be found on the present geographical frontier of the Hamato-Semitic family and the Black African family. The third concerns the West Atlantic or Senegal Guinea group. From the work of Meinhof, 16 De La Fosse, 17 Meek, 18 Lucas, 19 and Cohen, 20 to that of Greenberg in 1948, 8. N. Tucker and M. 8. Bryan in 1966, 21, and the recent criticisms of T. Sobenga, 22. It emerges that there is no complete agreement either on the data, the method of classification, the members of the groups, or the genesis and character of the relationships of the languages between the Nile and the Chad Basin. Yet geography, in particular, and proximity unquestionably give these languages a real unity. The age-old parallel existence of Black African and Semitic languages has led to a large stock of mutual borrowings. These two-way contributions make it difficult to draw the line between the original stock and outside acquisitions. The problem is to know whether the vocabulary proper to ancient Egyptian, Hausa, Coptic, Baguirmi and Sero and Akkadic languages that occurs in Berber and in Semitic languages such as Arabic and Amharic is evidence of a family relationship or simply of borrowing. Data for ancient Egyptian goes back 4,000 years and that for Semitic 2,500 years. Comparable analysis of Chadic, Berber and Chalchidic does not exist 4 times prior to the 19th or 20th centuries of our era. In 1947 M. Cohen published his essay Comparative sur le vocabulaire et la phonétique du Mido-Semitique, in which he compares Egyptian, Berber, Semitic, Chalchidic and Hausa, to which he makes occasional reference. In 1949 Flow 23 and Hintsa 24 began to challenge Cohen's findings and even to question his methods. J. H. Greenberg, having in mind that the very notion of a Hamato-Semitic group was disputed, widened the range of its components. He suggested a separate fifth member, Chadic, and renamed the whole group Hamitic, and later, Afro-Asiatic. These conclusions. 16. C. Meinhof, 1912. 17. M. De La Fosse, 1924. 18. Semeek, 1931. 19. Che Lucas, 1936. 20. M. Cohen, 1947. J. H. Greenberg, 1948, Hamato-Semitic, SJFA, VI, pages 47 to 63. 21. 8. N. Tucker and M. 8. Bryan, 1966. 22. T. Sobenga, paper delivered at the Lagos Festival, 1977. 23. W. Flow, 1949. 24. F. Hintsa, 1951. 242. History and linguistics. Provoked controversy from the moment of their publication. Polowski 25 doubted whether it was possible at present to accept the existence of 5 branches. Greenberg, be it noted, repeated still without carrying conviction the predominantly geographical thesis about Chadic and its connections which he put forward in an article in Languages of the World. One only needs to refer to the contradictory classifications of Greenberg, Tucker and Bryan, constantly brought into question even by the authors themselves, to gain an idea of the inconclusive nature of their proposals. Recent work gives substance to the notion of a Chadic family, the borders of which extend far beyond the shores of the lake. NEWMBN and IMBA 26 in 1966 and LESBIA 27 in 1967 have improved our knowledge of Proto-Chadic. The HE work of Yabás 28 has charted its expansion in Chad itself. On the basis of systematic observation, a genetic link might be suggested between the Sero and Chadic groups and several languages classified as West Atlantic Serer, Foto, Wolof, Safan, etc. 29. These attributions alone cast doubt upon the whole attempt at classification, as if emphasized by C.T. Hodge in an excellent article. 30. The major problem of the nature of the links between the languages of the frontier between the Black African and the Hamitic languages remains unresolved. The sheer volume of published work that identifies the world of African culture with Semitic is a further problem. There is still the problem of the membership and even of the identity of the Black African language family. The Symposium on the Peopling of Ancient Egypt, organized by UNESCO in Cairo in 1974, emphasized this. On this occasion Professor S. Souderton recalled, by way of illustrating these uncertainties, that the Egyptian language could not be isolated from its African context and its origin could not be fully explained in terms of Semitic. Fine Report, page 29. Cushitic is another example of the present uncertain state of research and classification. Greenberg, Tucker and Bryan and the Soviet scholar Dolgop Aljazkaj have recently put forward 3 differing, not to say contradictory, classifications for the complex of languages Somali, Galar, Sidamo, Mbugu, etc. that goes by the name of Cushitic. Dolgop Aljazkaj's classification hinges upon a photological type of reconstruction based on a limited number of examples. In particular, he compares the labials P, D and F and dentals T and D in the languages, and classifies them in 10 subgroups, whereas his colleagues identify from 3 to 5. Greenberg ignores the phonological, morphological and grammatical data and concentrates mainly on a comparison of vocabulary. But here. 25. H. Polowski, 1964. 26. P. Newman and Armad, 1966. 27. Lesbia the History of Chadic Consonantismo cf. C. T. Hodge, 1968. 28. Y. P. Capril, 1972. 29. cf. P. Diane, 1976. 30. C. T. Hodge, 1968. 243. Methodology and African prehistory borrowing plays an important part. Tucker and Bryan, WHO criticize Greenberg's method, offer a classification based on a comparison of the pronoun system and the verb structure. They themselves regard the inclusion of some of the languages that they group together as doubtful, and emphasize the purely tentative nature of their approach. He can only observe that the outstanding feature of the classifications set forth here is their provisional nature. The same difficulties arise as regards the languages geographically bounded on the west by the Atlantic and extending along the coast from southern Mauritania to Sierra Leone. In 1854 Cole, in his Polyglotta Africana, classified them under the heading West Atlantic, basing his identification on their changes of prefix or initial or final inflection. This is a typical feature of Bantu but is not enough to define the group. Moreover, Cole later came to regard all these languages as unclassified. Delafos in 1924-31 and Westerman in 1928 asserted that the West Atlantic languages constituted a genetic group, and in 1963 Greenberg 32 gave his wholehearted approval to this. He called them the extreme western group of the Niger-Congo family. In the same year Wilson 33 and Delby 34 while noting the internal typological similarities of the group, completely rejected the idea of regarding these languages as a homogeneous and related group. In Details of Morphology, Syntax and Vocabulary, wrote Wilson, the West Atlantic or Senegal Guinea group is by no means an entity. Indeed, recent work by D. Sapir, 35, published in 1974, shows that there is no more than 5 to 10% common vocabulary between the great majority of these languages, the only unifying factor in most cases, as has been suggested elsewhere, being geography. Here, as in the Nile-Chad area, migration intermingled peoples of different origins. They are bracketed together, perhaps too hastily, in the absence of precise information that would enlighten history and the historian. It is here, moreover, that linguistics as a tool of historical research suffers at present from serious limitations. The research worker is faced by the twin obstacles mentioned above. Research has met with no success because it remains incomplete and embryonic. In the second place, the tentative results of research can often not be used because they are falsified by distortions of approach and ideology. Ideological distortions. History is the favorite haunt of ideology. Ideology develops around and within it. The earliest works on the African past and on African languages. 31. M. De La Fosse, 1924. 32. J. H. Greenberg, 1963 b. 33. W. Wilson, 1966. 34. D. Telby, 1905. 35. D. Sapir, 1971 b. 244. History and linguistics coincided with the European colonial expansion. Such works were strongly tainted with the contemporary notions of racial supremacy. The ethnocentric viewpoint was a natural expression of the need to judge the value of any civilization by internal reference. It led them to appropriate to themselves the most distinctive points of any civilization in order to legitimize their world dominance in thought and power. The theories of the primacy of the civilizing Indo-European, Aryan or white man are evidence of excesses which still today leave profound reverberations in a number of works on African history and linguistics. 36. Egypt was for a long time set on one side by comparison with the rest of the continent, or rejuvenated for the benefit of Mesopotamia or other centers of civilization which were assumed, on the basis of unsupported speculation, to be Indo-European or Semitic. Bedouin art was allotted imaginary founders. The systematic theory of Hamitization 37 was worked out, so as to explain by external influences any interesting cultural features in Black Africa. Whilst seeking to promote a strictly scientific methodology, Greenberg, whose contribution, though not entirely beyond dispute, remains very fresh and important, sometimes echoes the negative aspects of ethnocentric ideology. Seligman and Meinhof, and also after them authors as important as De La Fosse, Baumann, Westermann and Mell, put forward some staggeringly unscientific arguments, based as they are on prejudices of the kind expressed by Meinhof when he wrote, "In the course of history one phenomenon has constantly recurred, namely that the Hamitic peoples have subjugated and ruled over the black-skinned peoples." Such an observation shows how careful we must be today when using any material which linguistic research makes available to historians or human scientists in general. "The vagueness of the use of the term Hamite," wrote Greenberg, "as a linguistic term, together with its extension as a racial term for a type viewed primarily as Caucasoid, has led to a racial theory in which the majority of the native population of Negro Africa is considered to be the result of a mixture between Hamites and Negroes. Thus in Races of Africa, c.